Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Dr. Adrienne Torres again. I'm here with Truth in My Days Director John Torres for a discussion about another important topic. John, you did a series on who wrote the gospel books. You said that liberal scholars and skeptics insist that the books are anonymous. No one knows who wrote them. But it was not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As you explained, this was not based on evidence, but was simply bias.
Yes. As I pointed out, during the era of the Enlightenment back in starting in the 16th century, really taking off in the 17th and then the 18th century in particular, an ethos developed among the intellectual leaders of society, the philosophers, the professors, to make man the measure of all things, to enthrone man and to drive out God. And that required undermining Christianity. And the best way to do that was to discredit the Bible, in particular the New Testament, and especially the gospel books. Because if you can get rid of that, you can undercut the case for Jesus and thereby, of course, destroy Christianity. Now, the problem for them is that, as we understood it, the gospel books were written by eyewitnesses, which meant that they were trustworthy as historical documents. And so they had to deny that they were written by eyewitnesses. They had to claim that the books were not really written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But as I showed in those earlier programs, the evidence completely demolishes these claims.
You mentioned that the dates of publication of the gospel books is fundamentally linked to their authorship.
Yes. And again, as I mentioned before, when we talk about publication in the ancient world, we mean the time at which the book is released for public use. Now, since the goal was to discredit the gospel books, the goal of these opinion makers, and since eyewitness testimony was the gold standard, it was not enough simply to claim that the books were anonymous. It was necessary to convince people that they were not eyewitness testimony. And that requires two elements. You see, because even if the books were anonymous, if Matthew, Mark, and John were not the authors, still, if they're written in eyewitness times, they have credibility because the writers could still have been eyewitnesses, and there were living eyewitnesses at the time who could have debunked anything they said that was wrong. So it was not enough for them to say that the books were anonymous. They also had to late date them. They had to claim that the books were published long after the time of Jesus.
So what was the claim they settled on?
They settled on the bald assertions of one scholar, a certain Ferdinand Christian Bauer, F.C. Bauer, who lived from 1792 to 1860. He was a highly respected scholar, teacher at the Tübingen School in what is now Germany. And the Tübingen School was the most respected theological school among liberal scholars. And Bauer dated Matthew, the first gospel book, he dated it to the year AD 130. Why do you think he picked that date?
Could it be 100, so many years later, maybe more than 100 years later than the events? That would mean that they're not accurate and they're not from eyewitnesses?
Exactly. He had no evidential basis, no reason for picking 130. But if Jesus died in the year AD 30, as he thought, it was actually 33. But if he died in AD 30, hey, let's just add 100 years to that. Bingo. Gospel of Matthew is out of eyewitness times, and so magically Matthew was written in AD 130. That's where the date came from.
I mean, was the number picked out of a hat, or did he have actually some evidence or something he based his guess on?
No, the number was essentially picked out of a hat, but even more was deliberately picked to put the book out of eyewitness times. There was no actual evidence. And that's actually standard practice for liberal biblical scholarship. And do note, by liberal, we mean scholars who deny the supernatural. Liberal biblical scholarship is not political liberalism. What it means is they deny anything supernatural, which means they deny miracles, they deny the resurrection of Jesus, they deny the deity of Jesus, and all of their scholarship is based on coming up with understandings, the best way to understand gospel books, Jesus himself, the beginning of Christianity, assuming that all supernatural is impossible. Now, their scholarship is based on pulling ideas off the top of their heads. It's not based on actual evidence. You remember when we looked at the authorship of the gospel books in that series, we quoted a highly respected liberal scholar, Dr. Gerd Ludemann, who said in one of his books, 3 presuppositions underlying my work are the following. First, the authors of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament are not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. And we pointed out at the time the meaning of the word presupposition. It's something that is accepted as being true, although there's no evidence for it. So here's this highly respected liberal scholar admitting that he simply presupposes that the books were anonymous and that the authors were not eyewitnesses. Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, along with the other editors of what they call the 5 Gospel, also wrote that the Gospels are now assumed to be narratives in which the memory of Jesus is embellished by mythic elements that express the church's faith in him and by plausible fictions. And again here, assumed, no evidence, simply assumed.
Surely some must have offered some evidence.
Bauer offered no evidence for these dates that he assigned to the gospel books. Bauer was influenced by the philosophy of Georg Hegel. He was the most influential philosopher of that era. He had this view of history that dealt with the status quo, we called the thesis, and whatever the status quo is gives rise to an antithesis, an antithesis that's in opposition to the thesis, and then there's a struggle between the two until they merge into a new synthesis. That synthesis becomes the thesis, gives rise to a new antithesis, struggles and so on. So there's this constant cycle of struggle and development. It was this kind of philosophy that was actually at the basis of Marxism and of Darwinism. And Bauer was very influenced by this philosophy. He decided that Christianity, as we know it, developed from a long struggle between Petrine, or Jewish Christianity, and Pauline, or Gentile Christianity. That Peter taught one thing, which is what the historical Jesus taught. Paul came in with a different message, and the two of them struggled with each other. And people like Luke and then whoever wrote John tried to synthesize the two. This was his view. It was not based on any evidence, of course, but it was his view. And everything he claimed then about the history of Christianity was hammered into this view of his.
Surely anybody who reads the New Testament would know that that is wrong, because Peter and Paul preach the same thing, and Luke is also recording the same message.
Well, you'd be surprised. Many of them do pick and choose and cherry pick different verses to try to make them look like they're against each other. But that's called massaging the evidence. For example, you might have heard the claim from liberal scholars that only 4 of Paul's letters were actually written by Paul: Romans, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And that is still scholarly orthodoxy to this day. And they try to cook up reasons for it based on vocabulary and style, which are bogus reasons. But where it actually came from was Bauer. But in Bauer's view, Paul was pugnacious. Paul was always ready to attack his critics and fight. And so any letter in which he seemed to be fighting, like Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Galatians, was from Paul. And any letter that was Irenic, that didn't involve this kind of attitude, well, it has to be a forgery. And that is really no basis. And yet today, as I said, it's scholarly orthodoxy and in liberal circles that only these three are authentic. And I wonder how many of the people who claim that have any idea that this idea originated with Bauer's own personal views of how Christianity developed, not on the basis of any evidence.
Even if someone does not know how it originated, it still made no sense to me, because here you're making Paul a complex character, like any human being, to be one-dimensional, can only have one emotion and only write one kind of thing. That's totally not realistic.
I agree with you on that. I think Bauer's approach was a complete non-starter. It was not critical, it was not historical, it was not scientific, although the scholars like to present it that way. What he said was basically fiction. It was a fairy tale. But hey, he's from Tübingen, and there's the ethos of the day that wants to discredit the New Testament, and so his views were accepted. They were considered definitive, and that's how liberal scholarship worked, and that's how it has worked and continues to work up to this day.
Wait, when you say it was accepted, by who? Were they accepted by people who really believe Jesus as Christ?
I doubt that most of these professors and intellectuals were actually Christians in terms of having saving faith in Jesus. Most of them were not. But this is the thing. They were the professors. They were the intellectuals. They must know what they're talking about. I think for a long time across the board, ordinary Christians, lay Christians, had no idea of these debates going on at all, or these ideas being floated, particularly in North America. A lot of this was going on in Europe, mostly starting in Germany, German states, and then France and Britain. And the New Testament was being undermined. So was the Old Testament. And most of the Christians here in North America were completely unaware of it. But what it does do is it seeps into the seminaries and into the universities. And these are the people who train the pastors. Now, the pastors may come in to have genuine faith, but when they hear these kind of claims and they hear that these are based on scientific analysis, that these are assured results of scholarship, they tend not to question them. They tend to accept them and then try to bend their view in such a way that they can continue to hold on to their faith, but their view of the Bible becomes quite warped. And that's the problem, as we'll see, not so much what liberals are saying. We expect those people to be against the Bible. The real problem is how many evangelical scholars have bought into this.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.